Thanks, Peter, for the introduction, and thank you, AI2, for giving me the opportunity to come here and talk about my work and meet with all of you. So yeah, I'm going to be talking a little bit about my thesis research, basically a subset of my thesis, and how it relates to knowledge representation with structured semantic feature spaces. This is joint work with my advisor, Ed Hovey, and also members of my committee, Chris Dyer, and some of you may know Peter Turney. But I'd also like to give thanks to my friends and colleagues, Manal Faruqi, Jesse Dodge, and Noah Smith, with whom part of this work was done. So before I dive into the actual work, I'd like to set the context a little bit. Here's a diagram of NLP from 30,000 feet. When you think about it, natural language processing, from a computational perspective, is nothing more than a transformation from one set of symbols to another. The computer itself does not care what these symbols are. They could be words, part of speech tags, more structured elements such as trees. They could be lexicons. We don't know, and in fact, the computer doesn't care. It takes an input set of symbols. It featurizes them in a certain way. Then in the machine learning context, it learns or applies a model to this featurized input. And then it decodes or transforms this input into the output set of symbols that you care about. And throughout this process, there is some overarching knowledge that sits above and kind of guides this process. And my research actually sits right at the start of this pipeline in featurizing the input, and specifically in the relation between that featurization and knowledge. Before we go further, let's define these two concepts a little more. So when I think about knowledge representation, at least in the context of natural language processing, I think about it as a two-layered problem. One, the first problem that you're trying to ask yourself is, what knowledge do you really want to represent? Is it a dictionary, an ontology, a lexicon, syntactic, semantic, or otherwise? Is it a more structured knowledge graph? Is it just basically a list of OpenIE sort of tuples? What knowledge are we really trying to represent? Once we decide on that, the next question is, how do you represent that knowledge? And there are typically several ways that you can go about doing this. You can represent it in some symbolic or discrete space, or in the more modern neural network sort of technology, you could represent it in a continuous vector space, sort of where features kind of are soft representations of the underlying knowledge. And then when you think about featurization, there's also two aspects. In the old style of machine learning and natural language processing, the researcher actually sat at the center of this feature engineering process. She was basically responsible for bringing domain knowledge to bear on the process of creating features from a data set, and then using those features to learn or apply a model. This unfortunately was often very laborious and time-consuming because it had a human in the loop. But because the researcher was typically an expert, you could infuse a lot of domain knowledge into the process of feature engineering. This work corresponds more to the second aspect, which is something called representation learning. And the idea here is to automatically discover a set of optimal features for a target application. The advantages are because it's automatic, therefore it's unsupervised, and there's no human intervention or bias, so it's a lot faster to do. But because of the way the problems are typically structured, it's hard to encode some sort of domain knowledge and bring that to bear to the process of feature representation. And my work really tries to link these two together and asks the question, what's missing? And I'd like to propose that if you took a joint view of knowledge and features, you could actually do better, in the sense that if features became your domain knowledge, if you could bring the structure in your knowledge to bear more effectively into the generation of your features, you could therefore do better. The benefits are that because you have a tighter integration, it means that there is more directly usable knowledge, but also, because of this fact, better features. And because it's in the first stage of the NLP pipeline that I showed on my first slide, it has important downstream repercussions. And the secret sauce to really bind these two aspects of knowledge and features together, I'd like to propose is structure. And specifically, we want to use structure to organize and basically connect an otherwise disconnected feature space. And this could be from the perspective of a human. If you give them structure, they're more likely to use that structure to engineer features. Or if you give a machine learning model which does representation learning, it could use the structure in interesting ways to learn better features. So informally, basically, this is the idea of my thesis. Sorry, skipped a slide there. It's a romantic coupling between structures and features gazing out onto the sunset of semantics and hopefully someday reaching there. You wanted to take a picture. But more formally, let's ask ourselves some research questions. I have some features. Can I improve them with some external domain knowledge or structure that I have? Or I want to generate better features. What is the best structure to use in a particular context? And finally, I have some features, but I don't have structure. Can I discover structure in these features? Fortunately, I only have a limited amount of time, so I'll give examples of the first two kinds of problems. I have covered the third kind of problem in my thesis, and I'm happy to talk to anybody who's interested in this. We have a couple of papers, and I'll point to more details about them at the end of my talk. But in this talk, I'm going to deal with the first two problems. I have some features. Can I improve them with external structure? And I want to generate better features. How do I use, what is the best structure to use to do this? Here's an outline for the rest of the talk. So the two questions that I asked on the previous slide, they're going to be dealt with by the problem of polysemy in vector space models and how you can use ontologies to, partially solve that. And then we're going to deal with the problem of question answering, very popular here at AI2 here, and how you can use tables basically to do better on this. I'll finally point to some other research that I've done during the course of my thesis related to the outline of this talk, but also some miscellaneous kind of research, and finally conclude and look forward to some future work. All right, ontologies and polysemy. Vector space models are hot. What are these? Basically, you have an unannotated corpus that you're given. You process that in some fancy way, and what you get as an output is a vector space model, where each word in your vocabulary is mapped to a high-dimensional vector in this space. It turns out that these models are very useful for a bunch of semantic operations, such as similarity computation. If you compare the distance between 2 points in this vector space, it turns out you're actually comparing the meaning between the two corresponding words. Or you could do something like analogical reasoning, where you take the difference between points and compare those to say things like king is to queen as man is to woman. These sort of very unsupervised ways of learning vector space models have been used for a bunch of downstream applications as generic features, and they've been hugely successful for things like question answering, dictionary building, essay grading, so on and so forth. But one problem is that many words have more than one meaning, and this is not restricted to English per se. Pretty much any language, you have multiple surface forms that map, one single surface form that might map to different meanings. And unfortunately, because your input corpus on which you're learning these vectors is unannotated, there's no way of knowing which particular meaning of a particular word you are dealing with in a particular context. So for example, if you encounter the word bank, you don't know which bank you're referring to. Is it the financial institution? Is it a river bank? And essentially what you're doing in a typical word2vec or in an LSA style model is just smashing all these different senses together into one vector, which you can't then separate. And what this work is going to try and do is to actually reverse engineer this process. Use some external structure to tease apart the different vectors that are kind of smashed together.
The left example is at the word level, and the right one, which is obviously funny, is at the phrase level.
Yes,
words
yes.
Or phrases or both?
We dealt only with words, but if your underlying ontology has phrases and you can learn those from corpora, you might you could just as well apply them to phrases. So, knowledge to the rescue. what kind of knowledge? What we're dealing here with is ontologies such as WordNet. And they're a convenient knowledge source to use for the problem that we have at hand. First of all, they're inventories of word senses. They contain all the word senses that we perhaps care about. In the case of WordNet, you could argue too many senses, perhaps. And then there's also, importantly, structure. That remember that secret sauce? There is structure connecting the senses to the other in some sort of a tree or a graph. And there are also type relations between two senses that you could leverage in an interesting way. And the intuition is basically to use the relational neighborhoods given to you by this ontology to kind of tease apart the vectors that you learn from your input corpus. All right, formalizing this notion a little bit more, we're going to define a Markov network for the ontology. So you know Markov networks are basically undirected graphical models, and we're going to have two basic kinds of variables. You have observed nodes on which you're going to get the single sense vectors that you get as input from your corpus as observed nodes. So you already get these vectors, you don't want to update them. And then you have an unobserved set of nodes for each of the senses in your ontology that you care about. And these are essentially the variables that you're going to be, the vector valued variables that you're going to be trying to infer. Given this, you're going to define the energy of the Markov network based on a set of clique potentials. And again, there are two kinds of them. The clique potentials that connect the red and the gray nodes. That's to say the single sense to each one of the multiple senses of a particular word. And then you have gray to gray clique potentials which define things that are connected in the ontology themselves. So money and bank would be connected. Here's a more graphic illustration of this. So you have the red nodes. These are the observed nodes. You get vectors for each of them sitting on them. And then you have clique potentials, red to gray, for each of the different senses, bank 1 and bank 2. And presuming that there's only a single sense for river and money, you connect them in this way. And then finally, you have gray clique potentials connecting the different senses one to the other. And if you see, there's this V structure between bank 1 and bank 2 and the single sense. And you'd use the opposing strengths, pulling these two vectors apart to basically infer the different senses of bank 1 and bank 2. Mathematically, yes?
When you're saying single sense, I mean, I can assume that the single vector for the word back encodes both meanings of the word.
That's the hypothesis, because we're from the input corpus, we're dealing with counts that are mixed, basically.
Yeah, so basically it's one single sense, and maybe one single vector for multiple senses.
Yeah, single vector, sure, yeah.
So we're trying to take this vector and
Okay.
find the part that is financial and the part that is
Exactly. So yeah, more precise term would be a multi-sense single vector, if you prefer. Good point.
So how do you determine which pairs of gray nodes are connected?
This is given to us by the structure of the ontology. So if, for example, bank 2 is a syn set, or say in a hypernym of the set river, then you would connect them, for example.
Is it just based on the hypernym relations in WordNet, or is it?
You could basically use any relations you care about. I'm going. In the first part of the work, I'll show that we use synonyms. That's say things that occur in the same syn set, hypernyms and hypernyms. And then I have a nice little experiment at the end showing how you can use basically antonym relations to actually push things further apart to learn vectors for antonyms.
This example, bank and river, what's that relation?
Bank, well, I cooked up. I don't know. This is just to basically illustrate kind of how you would connect things together. This isn't actually from WordNet.
I see. Okay.
Sorry if that wasn't clear. So mathematically, this is how it looks. You basically have a mapped objective defined over the energy of the Markov network, and you place basically Euclidean norms on each of the clique potentials. And it's basically a weighted sum of all the clique potentials we defined on the previous page. And so you have things you want to be closer together. Basically a multi-sense single vector, and each of the different senses you want them to be close together. So you want to rely on your data that's given to you by the first set of clique potentials. And then you also want to rely on the structure of the ontology, which is given to you by the second part, the gray clique potentials. And you have basically weights controlling how much you want to rely on the vectors versus how much you want to rely on the structure of the ontology. So you could basically think of your ontology as some sort of a structured prior to guide the way you're learning your vectors in this process. Sure.
One thing that these models seem to be learning is that you also have information from this single vector with multiple senses. So you would expect that the vector for bank would also, the original vector, the multiple senses would also be kind of related to money and kind of related to river. Are you not using this information?
We are, because we're connecting it to each of the different senses. We're basically relying on the data partially, but partially also on the structure of the ontology to guide the process of learning. So,
but you're not comparing red points one to another.
red.
It's red to gray and gray to gray.
No, we are not. OK, I probably didn't get your question then. No, we do not connect red to red. Indirectly, there may be a link, but yeah.
So for a red node, I would have a number of gray nodes.
Mm-hmm.
I would have, as a human, I would have like 2, 3 senses. Would this map one to one number of gray nodes, or I have 2, 3 human senses as 20 gray or 100 gray nodes, for example?
Well,
what's the relationship there?
basically, that the relationship is given to you by the ontology itself. So if WordNet says there are 5 senses, we take that as the truth. And linguists could argue that that's not necessarily what exactly we mean by the 5 senses. Maybe the distinctions are too fine or too coarse. But basically, we rely on the ontology to give that to us. We don't define it ourselves. It's a good question. All right, so this is the objective that we have. It turns out that it's nice because it has a closed form solution, but optimizing is intractable because it involves basically inverting a matrix the size of the vocabulary. So what you do is simple coordinate descent. The objective is convex. It converges within 5 to 10 iterations. Super computationally friendly. My 8-year-old laptop could run it in like 45 seconds. And at the optimum, basically, you have a very intuitive solution that the optimum vector for a particular sense is a weighted sum of all its neighbors. And it's applicable to basically any vector space model. You learn it from Word2Vec, you learn it from Glove, you learn an input from like LSA. We don't care. We just plug this into this method, give us the structure of WordNet, and we'll give you sense retrofitted vectors. And this is a process that we call retrofitting, which is closely related to something we worked on with Manal Faruqi et al. In an ACL 2015 paper. All right, so, but what if you wanted to learn senses while training? Well, we got you covered there as well. In this case, we can't apply it to any vector space model, but we can apply it to a large class of models, specifically those that try to learn representations by maximizing the likelihood of a corpus. And typically, these work by computing the probability of word context pairs over your entire corpus. And the way you do this is to introduce latent variables for your senses and marginalize over those. And you introduce basically the retrofitting process as a structured regularizer. And this intuition basically engenders not so much a single method, but a whole family of adapting techniques. And we'll give an example of how you can work with one. But it's basically a framework to take any maximum likelihood model and adapt it to deal with senses. So this is how you would do it for the skipgram model. The skipgram model, in case quick refresher for those that don't remember, is you take a word and try to maximize the probability of predicting the context words. And so you modify the generative story slightly. Instead of directly predicting the context words, you predict a particular sense first, a latent sense, and that latent sense then predicts all your context words. This leads to a very minimal modification on how skipgram is optimized. Because you have latent senses and its maximum likelihood, well, EM. In particular, we use hard EM. So given a word in a particular context, we pick the sense that is most likely to occur, and that's the E step. And then having picked that sense, we maximize the probability of that sense predicting the context words. And we do this using what the original skipgram used, which is negative sampling. And the only difference is this part which is in red, boxed in red. And this is that we take a negative step, negative gradient step with respect to all the senses that were not selected in the E step. So really simple modification. Almost no effort. You can take the skipgram and also train it with senses given the ontology. And that's the final part. You use periodic retrofitting to account for the structure of the ontology. Here's some experiments that we ran to evaluate both kinds of methods. We ran most of our in fact, all our experiments with English WordNet, approximately 200,000 nodes, 500,000 edges if you take into account synonym, hypernym, and hypernym edges. As a training corpus, we had the WMT English monolingual corpus. We evaluated on two kinds of vectors, global context and skipgram, and three different kinds of stars. Similarity scoring, where you have a pair of words and you want to predict how similar they are, and you are evaluated on the correlation with human assigned scores. And then a second task, which is synonym selection, which is given a target word and a bunch of options. You want to pick the one which is most synonymous to your target. And finally, we have something called contextual similarity scoring, which is very much like the first task, except that now you have context instead of the two words occurring in the void, basically. Here's a bunch of numbers for the first two tasks, and there's more in the paper, but basically, I'd just like to draw your attention to the fact that most of the bold-faced numbers are in rows corresponding to our models, so that's nice. In particular, we often outperform the baselines by significant margins. So the single single rows are basically your single vector models. Multi and IMS are basically multi-sense embeddings, but that are not tied to an ontology. IMS in particular works by disambiguating the entire corpus and then training vectors. So you assign senses from WordNet beforehand and then train your vectors. And our retrofitting procedures, we have a single one for global context vectors and retrofitting, as well as the EM retro, the second model that I introduced for our skipgram models. The only place where we don't do better than the original is on the WS353 dataset. And we investigated why, and it turns out that this particular dataset has two kinds of word pairs that we're dealing with. We have similar word pairs, and then we have related word pairs. But because we're using WordNet to kind of enforce the structure of an ontology, it turns out WordNet relations that we're using, hypernyms, and synonyms, actually reinforce similar words to the detriment of related words that we might learn from corpora. And if we... What are the numbers, like 65, 30? So that's row correlation score. Spearman row. Yeah. The other one is just percentage accuracy on picking the best synonymous word. All right.
For the other word similarity task, are the words given with word senses, or do they just say?
No, just two words in the void. So in the case of multi-sense embeddings, what you would do is take an average over all the senses. Or if you had more knowledge with the task that you were dealing with, for example, synonym selection, you want the most synonymous sense, then you could basically do a max, for example.
And does humans give the gold standard to these?
So for the first task, yes, it's basically an average over multiple human raters, the similarity between word pairs. And then for synonym selection, it's basically something that's like from a TOEFL test or whatever.
Are the humans given clear instructions what to do about ambiguous words? Bank and money, similar?
No, they don't deal with those specifically. But so I'm not sure how many synonymous words, polysemous words are in this data set. But the next data set actually deals with that problem specifically when you give context to human annotators. I'm presuming annotators who are not given any instructions on how to deal with polysemous words probably pick the most frequent sense or the most likely sense given the other word as a disambiguator, for example. That's an excellent point. So here's the second task that we evaluate on. Similar sort of story, but just to point out that in this case, the simple retrofitting does not work as well as the EM plus retrofitting methods. And this sort of makes sense if you think about it. In that case, we're just getting vectors and then we're training with an ontology. But when we're evaluating, we want to kind of disambiguate words given their specific context. And if we actually use context to train these embeddings, which we do in the case of EM plus retro, or just simple EM, we do a lot better. As promised, here's a quick experiment about actually doing the same sort of process, but introducing antonymy links. And this is to solve the problem where in a vector space model, typically you learn similarity between words based on the occurrence in context. So things like good and bad would have very similar embeddings because they basically occur in a lot of similar contexts. But do you really want this to happen? It turns out that with this process, you can account for that problem and sort of solve it. And which is basically the weights that we introduce for each of the kind of factors. We put a negative weight on that instead of a positive weight for, say, synonyms, hyponyms, and hypernyms. And the only problem that we have to now deal with is that because we have negative weights, if things occur in cliques and each of them is antonymous to the other, basically your objective can diverge arbitrarily. And so we basically heuristically stopped updating specific terms when the norm of the vector grows beyond a certain point. And that sort of works because when we evaluate on closest to opposite verb selection, which is basically a task a lot like synonym selection, except you are trying to pick the word which is most opposite to a particular verb, we get a nice boost in numbers as opposed to if you had a single sense baseline. Quick qualitative analysis. On the left-hand side, you have polysemous words and how, if you had only a single vector, what the top 3 similar words are. Not very informative, but if you do the retrofitting procedure, basically you get for each of the different senses, their most similar words in the vector space tend to correspond to that particular sense of the word. So hanging as in suspending versus hanging in decoration have different close words to each other. Also, in terms of computational efficiency, both the models are pretty efficient. The retrofitting process, as I said, is super fast, can work on pretty much any computer, laptop. Doesn't matter because it deals with the size of the vocabulary, not the corpus. The EM plus retrofitting method, again, just a small extension of the original method. So it's on the order of magnitude of the original maximum likelihood method that you're trying to adapt. So skipgram in this case, approximately 4 hours. In comparison, if you were to pre-annotate your corpus with senses using either a supervised or an unsupervised model, you could take 3 days with a supervised model versus almost 1 year, which we only were able to run on a cluster in an unsupervised fashion. So that's about it for the first part of the talk. Quick thematic recap. The features that we were interested in were sense embeddings from unannotated corpora. The knowledge that we wanted to encode were word senses in an ontology. And the structure that we used, that we brought to bear to achieve this task was basically the typed ontological links on how to disambiguate. Yes, Ashish?
If you go 3 slides back where you have that equation with alpha and beta, and just one detailed question. Yeah,
sure.
And not just for antonymy, also for the other one. So beta, I assume, is some constant related to the relation.
Exactly, that's relating these two words.
The balance between alpha and beta depend on the number of senses, like 20 senses versus just like 2 senses of the word?
Absolutely. We didn't optimize this, but that's a fantastic idea. We thought of that, and that's an experiment, in fact, that's there to be submitted in my thesis. To basically play around with the weights in a smarter way rather than assign like fixed weights based on a single, like 1 to synonyms, 0.5 to hyponyms, which is what we did in the paper. So that's an excellent point.
Was WordNet the most effective ontology for
It was the most commonly used basically in the literature, which is why we used it. Also simplest to use. I don't remember if we tried using any other ontology, but sorry, no, I don't have. Yeah. Okay, so to the next part, which is,
Question before you move on.
okay.
So your original pitch was we can improve NLP by doing better feature representation.
We can,
So do you have any like actual NLP tasks besides word similarity?
not on this, on this paper. We did try doing word sense disambiguation with the vectors. The results were sort of mixed, but then thinking about it in context, we trained the vectors in isolation of the task itself. And I think in the overall theme of kind of tying these two together, it's also important to think about the task, downstream task, the way you generate the features. So. All right, tables and question answering. This was basically a spin-off from my internship project. So apologies to those who have seen some of it before. All right. So given a complex problem such as question answering, one could ask ourselves, what is the best form of background knowledge to bring to bear to this task? And really, there's basically a spectrum that you can think of. On the one extreme, you have highly unstructured knowledge, which comes to you in the form of text corpora. And these are really easily available on the web in large quantities. But unfortunately, because of their format, they're hard to reason with in a principled way. On the far end of the spectrum, you have highly structured models, which are basically things like knowledge bases, ontologies, knowledge graphs. And they're really nice because you have principled ways of reasoning over them. But the problem is that they're hard to come by. And especially for a new domain, new language, you really don't want to start from scratch building one of these things for your particular problem. And so what we explored basically was something in the middle, specifically tables with text entries. And the question is, does this represent a balanced compromise? And hopefully what we showed was, yes, it does. Because it has text entries, it's kind of sort of unstructured, but it does have some structure in the form of rows and columns that are sort of related to each other. I know since my internship project was completed, there's been a lot of really cool work coming out of AI2 on things between tables and unstructured data on kind of how to really leverage basically things in the space of OpenIE sort of tuples, or basically to generate a knowledge base from unstructured data. But well, we use tables. And at the heart of using these tables are two research questions, overarching theme being, can we build a question answering system using knowledge within tables as a formalism for the task? And we have two parts. One is, given the structure of the tables, can we have human annotators generate a set of high quality multiple choice questions? And then together with the data set that we created in the second part, can we use the tables to answer the questions for an unseen test set? When we talk about tables, this is basically the kind of structure that we're dealing with. Simple sort of table about phase change of matter. You have a header row which defines a prototype of configurations. And then each of the following rows is basically a multi-slot predicate, which is an instantiation of the prototype. And then when you look at the columns, you have the header defining a sort of hypernym, and then each of the things occurring in that particular column, a hypernym of that hypernym. Given this structure, can we answer simple questions? So for example, which form of energy is needed to change water from a liquid to a gas? It turns out, if you're able to align specific elements of the tables, such as form of energy to a particular column, energy required, and then from a liquid gas to a particular row in the table, vaporizing liquid to gas, the answer to this question sits at the intersection of these maximally aligned rows and columns to a particular question and answer set. And if we are able to find this optimal alignment, we should be able to answer our questions. Now, the astute listener might ask, is lookup really enough? Well, the honest answer is no, but it does cover a simple majority of the multiple choice questions in the domain, more than 70%. So it was pretty easy and quick to develop a system that produced pretty good results with not much effort. For more complex reasoning, such as reasoning over multiple rows in tables or chaining things across different tables, my good friend Daniel Khashrabi and his intern mentors Ashish and Tushar had a very nice paper on how you can use an elegant ILP solution to handle these sort of cases. And I just saw a recent follow-up to that work at an ACL paper, I think. Very cool work. But looking forward, I think we were hoping to do it in the internship, but we didn't get to it, was basically combining these two sort of things. Assigning soft edge weights to the ILP support graph from sort of continuous representations. All right, the tables that we had were a November 2015 snapshot, I think, of the Aristo Tablestore. So things may have been updated since then. We had 63 handcrafted tables, about 3,850 facts, between 2 and 5 content columns. And the tables are organized by topics. So some of them are bounded, like the example that we just gave, faves, change of matter. There's only a fixed number of them. But you could also have unbounded tables, such as what is the energy required to perform a certain action. And you would list only a subset of the examples possible in the domain. The facts themselves are targeted at the AI2 multiple choice question dataset. So they were reverse engineered from the questions in Regents and Monarch, but were later extended manually by doing web searches. So this was the input. We didn't actually do any work to create these tables. The rest of the part actually was the work in the paper. Specifically given a table, this is how we set up our crowdsourcing task. We highlighted a particular cell in red, and we told annotators, please create a question such that the cell in red is the answer to the question. And we gave them a bit of scaffolding information to actually simplify their task. We told them, you can use cells highlighted in blue to create your questions, and then the multiple choices can be created from things highlighted in yellow. We did obviously give them the freedom because we didn't want them to create all the same sort of questions, to reword things, to use additional information. But what's nice is once they had created these multiple choice questions, we got alignment data free from the annotation task. Specifically, given a multiple choice question that we created, we knew exactly where the answer was. We knew exactly which cells the question was created from. We knew what cells the answer choices were selected from, so which column. So we know row, table, information exactly for a particular multiple choice question. And this is important because if you remember a couple of slides back, finding the optimal basically answer to a row column intersection involved alignment. This is the alignment that we get for free from that task. The data set itself basically consists of questions such as these. It's freely available thanks to AI2. Thanks for the funding to actually do this. And the data set was created by Turkers much more efficiently by, say, doing things like rewriting a question, paraphrasing, or adding a choice. It turns out almost 3 times faster than any of the other methods because of all the scaffolding information from the structure of tables. Answering questions with tables, as you would recall, basically involved, for simple type of questions, an intersection between an optimal row and some columns. And this is exactly what we get from our data set, free alignment from multiple choice questions. And we will use this. Basically, our model is pretty standard. It's a log linear model consisting of a bunch of features. The features themselves, because this talk is about features and structure, deal with the structure of tables, specifically things that are featurized over entire tables, specific rows, columns, and individual cells. And we also introduce a bunch of embeddings for doing soft constraints, basically matching between table elements and multiple choice questions. The model itself is called FRETS, which stands for Feature-Rich Embedding Table Solver. And it can be used to answer questions by basically taking the score of the maximal the score of the row over which you have assigned maximum individual scores. Why do you do this? Well, it turns out that although the individual answer might be at a particular cell, because of the way we featurize our alignments, over an entire row, we have to take the sum of the entire row to find the best answer. Training also is pretty standard because it's a log linear model. We can train it using negative cross entropy. And the so-called gold standard distribution we get from converting our multiple choice table, MCQ table alignments to basically response variables. So essentially for a correct answer, we want our system to pick the correct cells. But for an incorrect answer, we want to encourage the model to pick irrelevant information. Given this ugly equation, we basically optimize it using adaptive gradient descent. Yeah?
Is the alignment at the cell level or at the row and column level? Because your data is at the row and column level, do they actually point out which cells align with the question?
They do point to specific rows, elements in a row. I'm not sure about particular columns, but we avoid that. I'm not sure how reliable that is in the original data set, so we basically take things over the entire row. Yes?
So you use the alignment information for the rows and columns while training, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you can also think of it as like not having that information and think of it as learning a latent attention.
Sure.
Do you have an experiment?
We do not, but that's definitely something that could be tried. Treating them as latent alignments and then kind of trying to optimize those. That's a cool idea. So here's again a bunch of experiments to try basically this simple model. We have 3 data sets, regions, monarch. Remember, these are test sets, so these are unseen questions. And then we have the elementary school science questions, which is 855 multiple choice questions publicly available from AI2. The tables themselves, we had 3 settings, one only the regions tables, one the additional monarch tables, and once where we combine all the tables together. As baselines, remember the 2 extremes of that spectrum of knowledge that we talked about, so the models deal with each of those. One, we have an unstructured baseline, which is Lucene. You search over some text, and the score of the highest relevant document or sentence that's returned to you is basically what you assign to a particular question answer pair. And then we have, we report results for one data set from Tushar's EMNLP paper from 2015 on using Markov logic networks to basically answer questions. So highly structured model. So here's, again, a subset of the results from the paper. There's more if you're interested. You can look at the reference. And the models in blue are basically the unstructured Lucene baselines. The models in red are our Fretz models. And on one data set, you have the yellow Markov logic network. So overall summary, we do seem to do better than both of them. And in particular, we do much better than the Lucene baseline when it's given the same data. So if you take the tables, ignore completely the structure, and treat that as a corpus of sentences, the Lucene baseline does a lot worse than our model. So using structure helps a lot. And even if you fed the Lucene baseline with orders of magnitude more data, which is the Waterloo corpus, it still only performs on par and sometimes slightly worse than our Fretz models. Yes?
So when you run Lucene on these tables, do you just sort of treat each row as sort of as one item?
Yes.
One sentence?
Yes.
So there's no indication of what the rows mean because you kind of ignore the
Yes.
further? Okay.
Basically.
If you added that information to the Lucene, so let's say you could just add like the column header as a prefix to each row. Right?
We could do that. We didn't try that, but that would probably help some, I think, the
Right,
Lucene.
Because as you're going to lose a lot of information if you don't know what the row stands for.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually have done that experiment with that additional information.
Okay.
And I don't know exact numbers, it did help, but not too much.
Okay.
Okay.
Just a
Good to know.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah,
what you
Sumitra.
get back from your Lucene search is the entire sentence representation of the row, right? But you have to pick
We don't.
multiple choices.
So given a particular question answer pair, Lucene returns the most relevant sentence or row in a table with a score. and we use that score to we basically assign that score to the question answer pair. So you have a question, 4 answers, correspondingly 4 scores, you pick the one with the highest score. That's basically how you answer the question.
Sujay, if I understood your answer to my previous question correctly, you're not relying a lot on the column structure, you're relying more on the rows being grouped together into?
That's not entirely true. To align the question, we use the row information more because that's how the questions were created. But for the multiple choices, to align those, we do use the column information. So we have a bunch of features dealing with columns. So we extract things from the question, such as what is the expected answer type. So what form of energy, we have form of energy extracted as a phrase, and we try to align that to a header of a particular column. So for example, those are the kinds of things we do use also in column alignment. Yes,
so
Soren?
when I look at the results, it strikes me as kind of glass half empty, half full. You know, you can look at it both ways. I'm curious, how do you think about, what's your takeaway from the numbers here?
I think probably the takeaway is summarized in a previous slide when I said there's a majority of the questions tend to be answered with very simple sort of reasoning, which is why our model works well. But the half empty part is that we don't do more complex reasoning, or at least we don't gather those sort of alignments from our task. So combining this model with more principled solvers such as the ILP with soft constraints given by, say, vector spaces or some sort of soft features would help, or treating the alignments as latent and trying to do some sort of attention mechanism would help. So I think that would fill the glass a little more. Yes?
And did I understand it correctly that basically these questions were generated from the tables or vice versa? So that
The questions were generated from the tables.
Right.
The tables themselves encoded information from the region's training.
right.
Yeah. So
So if you only get up to 60%, and it seems like with that kind of setup, you almost should get a
much higher score.
much higher performance.
So, well, I mean, the test and training sets might differ. So you might have words that don't occur in the training, for example, and you might miss things like that. We did try an experiment where initially we took questions that were exactly in the training set and then trained them with this particular model, and it got like 85-ish%, which is much higher. So we do learn how to answer questions exactly for the tables with the structure that we are given. But if we extend it to the test set with the soft embedding sort of features, understandably we do get some lower numbers.
But it does have this other implication that maybe makes the glass a little bit less full, which is
Okay.
that the techniques that are directly based on the tables are less robust to
Absolutely.
other question distributions,
Sure.
whereas the Lucene baseline one, but the Waterloo one in particular with a very broad corpus would probably not degrade in performance.
I agree. That's so while this worked for the tables that we had for the domain that we were dealing with, in a broader sense, having a much larger set of abstract tables would probably be helpful, or just basically a set of rules that you extract from some OpenIE system and kind of use a similar logic to think about them as basically mini parts of tables, I guess. Yes, Matt?
Are there similar kinds of tables that you can just crawl from the web? So just like we went from the Lucene over tables to Lucene over Waterloo, could you go from frets over tables to frets over Waterloo tables?
The model itself, if it dealt with only text, perhaps yes. I have the intuition that it would work. So basically, you're learning features that abstract over the structure of the table. They're not directly dealing with the content. So it would work. But if you have things like numbers, that would screw up things a lot.
I guess
and-
I'm wondering about, like, are there similar kinds of tables to the Aristo table store that we could just crawl from the web to get a much larger Waterloo-like table corpus? And I don't know.
I don't know.
My experience is no, it's very difficult.
Bhavna had a nice paper which kind of dealt with, I think, interactively building tables from Corpora. Was that like really successful, or? Okay.
If you want to build lots of such tables, you need to come up with schema, and that is
I see. Okay.
Wouldn't you still need training examples for every new table?
F-
Questions.
in this particular setting, yes, because our model relies on the alignment between tables and multiple choice questions. But if you were to get rid of those, treat them as latent, as somebody suggested, then you no longer would. Perhaps that model would be more robust to larger data sets and more noisy questions. Any more questions?
Did you do that experiment to see if you trained your model using your generated questions on, say, 20 tables and then applied it to a question from a 21st table? Would it generate? Because the features are probably general.
We had sort of similar experiments because we split that. I don't know whether these don't contain those results. So the monarch tables are basically additional to the information that's already in regions. So essentially, it may have information that it's basically complementary information. So if we only trained on the monarch tables and then used those to answer questions, one would expect the scores to be lower. It turns out they are not a lot lower. So we do learn some generalization over the structure of the tables. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, sorry, those results are not on the slides. It's there in the paper. All right, so I think I can skip this slide. The takeaways from the experiments: improvements over unstructured and structured model and generalizations, what we've talked about at length. Quick ablation study, removing each set of features normally results in a drop in performance. Surprisingly not in one case on the regions test set. But we found that the most important types of features tend to be things that focus on cells and questions. This could either be because the question itself is really central to answering the question, so you want to align that really well, and the cell contains the answer. But it also could be because certain features that we replicate on larger groups, such as tables, might be replicating information. This is basically what I'm currently working on. It still deals with the training that we get from alignments, but the idea is to, rather than humanly generate the features, basically we had a human in the loop, so feature engineering better with structure with a human. This is how we want to do it automatically. So the idea is to basically still align questions to rows and then answers to columns, but instead of the human engineering features, we generate features automatically via either a vector space model, such as an embedding to a LSTM, and then combine the scores from rows and columns to kind of get a final prediction of how relevant a particular cell is. Okay, that's basically it for the second part. Thematic recap of the second part of my talk was the features that we were interested in was multiple choice question features relating a question to an answer candidate. We intermediated this through a knowledge base, which was a set of semi-structured tables. And the structure in these tables that we used was things like topics over tables, how rows relate, so how a prototype relates to the rows that follow it, and the hyponym sort of relationships in columns. Here's a quick overview of some of the other work that I've been doing during the course of my thesis. This work also deals with structured feature spaces. So I have some work on something we call faceted semantics. The idea here is to decompose a word vector into a word tensor, where each of the individual rows corresponds to the semantic signature in a particular relationship. And we have a couple of papers on that. Most recently, we have a paper under review at EMNLP on inducing a frame lexicon by using no annotation whatsoever, and the lexicon itself being embedded. And then I did some old work on speech summarization using the structure of a graph constructed from how similar utterances are prosodically, and basically doing random walks over those to do summarization. Here's some other miscellaneous work. We did something on discourse deixis coreference. So pronouns such as it, this, and that, when they no longer refer to entities, but to verb chunks, basically verb phrases that occur in the past. Some work on lexical simplification that I did during my previous master's thesis as an Erasmus Mundus student, We organized a shared task, and then we also had a system participating in that task. And then I did some fun work on generating parallel data using images as interlingua. We had a paper on that as well. Okay, so that's about it for my talk. To conclude, I presented basically a joint view of knowledge representation and feature engineering, where structure is a guideline to organizing a feature space in a way that you get better features. And because this is an early introduction in the whole NLP pipeline, hopefully it has important downstream applications. We dove into two in-depth examples of this principle. One on using the structure of ontologies to disambiguate and tease apart word sense vectors, and the second on using the structure of tables on helping to generate and then to answer multiple choice questions. I also presented very briefly some citations on research that cover other areas between interaction between knowledge and structure. So looking forward, I think this is a really exciting space with many potential domains of application. If you think about it, most of the NLP stack has some structure that can be brought to bear to improve the way we generate features and think about our models. And just some of the examples that I've been thinking of recently are representation learning over structured knowledge bases, such as Wikipedia's, a knowledge graph, or if you think about like topics over like scientific ideas, like something like a citation graph. I'm also interested in like combining knowledge from vision and language. So using basically the structure of the real world and how that is represented in images to learn things like prepositions, for example. And then the third idea is basically to use discourse, this higher level discourse structure to kind of learn features over things that might be interesting in co-reference. So words like pronouns tend to be typically empty, and learning vectors from them from corpora doesn't really make much sense. Can we learn some sort of contextually adaptive representation which changes based on how you're dealing with a particular pronoun in a context? And finally, I'm also really interested in discovering or extending structured knowledge, and a couple of chapters on my thesis actually deal with it. And I didn't have time to present any of that work, but I'm happy to chat about that with anybody who's interested. So, yep, that's about it. Thank you so much for your time. I hope I didn't run over. I guess there's a couple more minutes. If you have any questions, comments, I'm happy to hear them.